Namo Ramana. A very warm welcome to the Sunday Satsang with Ramana Kendra Delhi. May I now request Narayanji to initiate the Ramana Kendra Satsang with Puja and Updesh Saram. Thank you. Narayanji.
राम भरतरम विष्णु शशिवर्णम चतुर्भुजम प्रसन्नवदनं ध्याये सर्वविघ्नोपशान्तये अयमुक्त संसर्गोऽस्तु मन्दोऽनुक्रमन्दो अयमुक्त संसर्गोऽस्तु तदेव रघुवं सविनं तदेव तारावलं चन्द्रोलं तदेव विद्यावलं दिगों तदेव लक्ष्मीपते ते तेङ्गुलीगो स्मरामि ओम भुव ओम शिव ओम महत् ओम जन ओम तव ओम सत्यम ओम तत्सवितुर्वरेण्यं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो न प्रचोदयात् ओम आविर्भूतं ओम मोक्षरः नमोपाताय समस्त बुद्धस्य द्वारा परमेश्वरं कर्ष्यमाणस्य कर्मणः निर्वैरं पश्यामि आदौ विघ्नकर्मजं कर्ष्ये इत्यां विष्णुदेवता विद्याधना रोगादेवतं विष्णुनाथुना त्वं चत्वारि मां देवी पवित्रं मुरुगासनम् आगमातं देवानां कमनातं रक्षासां भण्डारं करामि यादव देववाहननाथनम् नमोपाताय नमस्कार बुद्धस्य द्वारा की परमेश्वर नित्यत्वम आदौ विघ्नकर्मजं कर्ष्ये गणानात्वा गणपतिं ववामहे कविकवीनां सूत्रमं ज्येष्ठराजं ब्रह्मणां ब्रह्मणस्पते आंसुकं सुदसादनम् अस्मिन् मर्यादे भागवतविद्यायां महागणपतिं आवाहयामि ओम महागणपतिये नमः समं समर्पयामि ओम महागणपतिये नमः अर्घ्यं समर्पयामि ओम महागणपतिये नमः पाद्यं समर्पयामि ओम महागणपतिये नमः स्मरणं समर्पयामि ओम महागणपतिये नमः उपसारिकस्नानं समर्पयामि ओम महागणपतिये नमः स्नानानन्तरमास्मरणं समर्पयामि ओम महागणपतिये नमः वस्त्रदानं अक्षतं समर्पयामि ओम महागणपतिये नमः इन्दोपदीनार्थम् अक्षतां समर्पयामि ओम महागणपतिये नमः गन्धां धारयामि समर्पयामि ओम महागणपतिये नमः गन्धोमयि अक्षतां समर्पयामि ओम महागणपतिये नमः अनन्तनाथम् अक्षतां समर्पयामि ओम महागणपतिये नमः कुंकुमं समर्पयामि ओम महागणपतिये नमः पुष्पे पूजयामि ओम सुमुदाय नमः ओम एकदंताय नमः ओम कपिलाय नमः ओम गजगन्नदाय नमः ओम लंबोदराय नमः ओम विघ्नाय नमः ओम विघ्नराजाय नमः ओम विनायकाय नमः ओम धूमकेतवे नमः ओम गणाध्यक्षाय नमः ओम बालचंद्राय नमः ओम गजाननाय नमः ओम वक्रतुंडाय नमः ओम शूर्पकर्णाय नमः ओम हिरण्मयाय नमः ओम स्कंदमूर्धवाय नमः ओम सिद्धविनायकने नमः ओम संकटमोक्षविनायकने नमः ओम त्रिपुरप्रे विनायकने नमः ओम महागणपतिये नमः नानाविध पत्र पुष्पाणि समर्पयामि धूपार्थं समर्पयामि पाठं समर्पयामि अक्षरां समर्पयामि भूर्भुवस्सुवः तत्सवितुर्वरेण्यं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो न प्रचोदयात् देवसवितुर्वरेण्यं नोदनं प्रसन्नामि अमृतोऽमृतं स्वाहा ओम प्राणे स्वाहा अपाने स्वाहा ध्याने स्वाहा उदाने स्वाहा समाने स्वाहा ब्रह्मणे स्वाहा महागणपतिये नमः महागणपतिये नमः महागणपतिये नमः कर्कण्डविद्यं समर्पयामि मध्ये मध्ये पानीयं समर्पयामि अमृतपुत्रं समर्पयामि नीराजनं कर्पूरं समर्पयामि कर्पूरं समर्पयामि गणानां गणपतिं नमामि विनामस्तकं जयकराजं ब्रह्मणां तुलसीदसादनं महागणपतिये नमः महागणपतिये नमः कर्पूरं समर्पयामि नीराजनं समर्पयामि नीराजनं आसमनीयं समर्पयामि स्वाहा ब्रह्मणे स्वाहा महागणपतिये नमः महागणपतिये नमः महागणपतिये नमः वक्रतुंड महाकाय सूर्यकोटि समप्रभ सर्वकार्येषु सर्वदा गणपति प्रसाद शिरसा प्रणामि ओम भो ओम भुव ओम स्व ओम मह ओम धन ओम तव ओम सत्यम ओम सत्सद्रोह्यम भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो न प्रचोदयात् ओम अवधूतसंपूर्णस्वरो ओम पार्थ समस्त दुर्दश द्वारा परमेश्वर नित्यत्वं शुभे शोभने मूर्ते आद्य ब्रह्मण विद्यमनार्थे श्रीवेदे वराहकल्पे वैवस्वत मन्वन्तरे अष्टाविंशतितमे कलियुगे दुनिमादे जम्बूद्वीपे भारतवर्षे भारतखण्डे नीरो दक्षिणे पार्श्वे सदाब्दे अस्मिन् वर्तमाने भावावधिके प्रभादिनां तृतीया संवत्सराणां मध्ये विरवनाम संवत्सरे दक्षिणायने वर्ष ऋतौ कन्नी मासे शुक्ल बच्चे चतुर्दशी तिथियां शुभतिथौ भानुवासरयुक्तायां सदविशेष नक्षत्रयुक्तायां शुभ नक्षत्र शुभ योग शुभ कर्म एवं गुण विशेषण विशिष्टायां अस्यां चतुर्दशी तिथियां शुभतिथौ शुभ जन्मापव जन्म प्रतिदेहजन मध्ये संभाविदानं सर्वेषां भावनं सत्यानुवाकम् अस्माहं तत्कुर्मानं क्षेमसम्पद्य वीर्यविजय आयुरारोग्य ऐश्वर्येण रमणवर्षे प्रसादेन वेदान्त्यसिद्ध्यर्थं रमणवर्षे पूजां करिष्ये तदङ्गं कर्म पूजां करिष्ये ईश्वर मेधास्थानं प्रतिष्ठापयामि सोमनाथे सीमाय पुनरागमनाय च कलशस्य मुखे विष्णुगड्डे रुद्रसमादित्य मूले तत्त्वसिद्धो ब्रह्ममात्रिमणे संददा कुशलसागरा सर्वे सप्तचुरा सुंदरा ऋग्वेदो यजुर्वेदो सामवेदोपकरण गंगे गोदावरी सरस्वती नर्मदे सिंधु कावेरी यदेश्वरी गुरु अग्ने सतैता सर्वे कर्ताम समादित्ता आयं देव पूजार्थं दुर्दश्य कारगा तमूरा सागरोत्पन्नो विष्णु विष्णु करे देवी मरण भांडन मुक्ते देव देवालय में देवस्थान है ज्ञान निर्माण स्वयं भवने पूजे ओम सकलनाथ शक्तियुक्ता योग विलासने नमः आधार शक्तिये नमः मूल प्रगतिये नमः आदिवराय नमः आदिमूर्माय नमः अनंताय नमः पृथ्व्यै नमः आदित्यादि नवग्रह देवताभ्यो नमः दश दिक्पालेभ्यो नमः गुरु ब्रह्मा गुरु विष्णु गुरुदेवो महेश्वरा गुरु साक्षात् परब्रह्म तस्मै श्री गुरवे नमः। ओम अस्य श्री प्राण प्रतिष्ठा मंत्रस्य ब्रह्मा विष्णु महेश्वरा विशेरे के सामगर्वाणी संदांसि सकल जगत सत्सदि सम्मारकाणि प्राण शक्ति परा देवता आम बीजम हरिम शक्ति ओम कीलकम प्राण प्रतिष्ठापने विनियोग आम दुष्टाभ्याम नमः हरिम गर्जनीभ्याम नमः ओम मध्यमाभ्याम नमः आम अनाभ्याम नमः हरिम निष्ठिकाभ्याम नमः ओम कर्दल दुष्टाभ्याम नमः आम इल्याय नमः हरिम शिरसे स्वाहा ओम शिवाय वसट आम कौसायम हरिम नेत्रदाय वसट ओम हस्तदाय पट गुरु सर्व दिग्बंध ज्ञानम रक्तांबोधिस्त बोधोलस तन्मदोड़ कराचे पासम बोधंड निक्षुत्व मणिमणि वर्जमाना विद्यान सुतवालं तुने रसिदा आपने वो सोर किया बाला तो नाम बहुत भी प्राण शक्ति बलान ओम आमरिं क्रोम क्रोमरिमाम अम्यम रंगलम वंशम सम्मा अंतस्सह ओम वंश अस्यामुतो विवृतिस्तु अस्यामुतो सर्वेन्द्रियाणि वामनस्वक्षसस्सोत्र दिव्या प्राणवाक अनुवाद आयुष्टानि या तस्ति स्वस्ति सुखं सुरं दुष्कन्तु स्वाहा। ओम अस्य श्री प्राणनिष्ठा मंत्रस्य ब्रह्मा विष्णु महेश्वरा विशेषके सामधर्माणि संतांसि सकल जगत सिद्धिदि सम्मार्गाणि प्राणशक्ति परा देवता आम बीजम हरि शक्ति लोक कीलकम प्राण प्रतिष्ठापने विनियोग आम अनुष्ठाभ्याम नमः हरि प्रतिनित्याम नमः लोक मध्यमाभ्याम नमः आम अनाभ्याम नमः हरि प्रतिष्ठाभ्याम नमः लोक कर्म प्रतिष्ठाभ्याम नमः आम इन्द्रियाय नमः हरि से स्वाहा ओम शिवाय ओम कौसाय अन्यदाय ओम पूर्व सर्व दिवंग असुवीरे पुनरस्मात् सक्सपुर प्राणवे नवदे भोगम जो पश्चिम सूर्य उच्चन्न मनोरे मया शक्ति आवायुदो भव अंडायुदो भव संयुदो भव नियुदो भव अवगुणिदो भव सुखदो भव सुमृतनो भव मुदो भव वरदो भव प्रसिद्ध प्रसिद्ध स्वामी सर्वजगन्नाथ यावत् पूजावसानकं तावत् दुर्गुणावेन दिव्येस्मिन् सन्निधत्कुरु। ओम नमो भगवते श्री कुबेराय नमः 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 लक्ष्मी प्रतिमान ईश्वरा साइड भगवान श्रवणोस्तोत्रम श्री गुरुभ्यो नमः गुरु ब्रह्मा गुरु विष्णु गुरुदेवो महेश्वरा गुरु साक्षात् परब्रह्म तस्मै श्री गुरवे नमः। अपार सच्चि सुगुवारि यासो यशो मात्रं गुणं नमस्तं गुणायितं तं रत्नं गंभीरं चिन्ताविनीनं निर्विचिन्तयामि। ओम महादेव महूतेन जाताय नमः ओम श्री रमणाय नमः ओम गुरवे नमः ओम अखंड संविताकराय नमः ओम महुदसे नमः ओम कारणोद्भवाय नमः ओम जगत्पितावताराय नमः ओम श्री भूमिनाथास्तलोचिताय नमः ओम पराशर कुलोत्साय नमः ओम सुंदरातनवत्पलाय नमः ओम कपीयचारित्राय नमः ओम सयायाम्बासयायते नमः ओम शोणासुरमौलीनमानसाय नमः ओम स्वर्णस्तगाय नमः ओम श्रीमद्वादशान्तमहास्थलेलुप्तविद्योदयाय नमः ओम महाशक्तिनिवादेन प्रबुद्धाय नमः ओम परमात्मविदे नमः ओम दिव्याय नमः ओम पितृप्रदानेशिने नमः ओम पितृमदे नमः ओम पितृराजस्य षोडशेन प्राप्ताय नमः ओम तमोमयाय नमः ओम उदासीनाय नमः ओम महायोगिने नमः ओम महोत्साहाय नमः ओम कुशाग्रतीये नमः ओम शांतसंकल्पसंभवाय नमः ओम सुतुसे नमः ओम सवित्रे नमः ओम वीराय नमः ओम तमस्वी सर्वंगाय नमः ओम बुल्लांबोध विरोधिनाय नमः ओम चंद्रिका सुदास श्रीमन विधान मंडलाय नमः ओम सूर्यवाक्यम समासीनाय नमः ओम सूर्यदाक्षिण विप्रमाय नमः ओम वेद वेदांत तत्वज्ञाय नमः ओम चिन्मुद्रे नमः ओम त्रिगुणाधिकाय नमः ओम विरूपाक्ष भुवावासाय नमः ओम नीलादिक सदा बुद्धिये नमः ओम मुक्तिदाय नमः ओम पूर्णाय नमः ओम रसिदासुजातवाय नमः ओम गंभीराय नमः ओम परमाचार्याय नमः ओम सुब्रसन्याय नमः ओम अभयप्रदाय नमः ओम दक्षिणासीनिवाय नमः ओम धीराय नमः ओम दक्षिणादिमुगाय नमः ओम स्वरागे नमः ओम महर्षिये नमः ओम भगवते नमः ओम ईट्याय नमः ओम भूम विद्या विशारदाय नमः ओम विमलाय नमः ओम दीर्घदर्शने नमः ओम आप्ताय नमः ओम रुजमार्ग प्रदर्शकाय नमः ओम समत्रुते नमः ओम सत्यत्रुते नमः ओम सत्याय नमः ओम प्रसादाय नमः ओम अमित विक्रमाय नमः ओम सुकुमाराय नमः ओम सदानंदाय नमः ओम मृदुवासिने नमः ओम दयानवाय नमः ओम श्री सोनासुर युगपुरस्कर्ता सन्निकेतनाय नमः ओम सद्दर्शनोपदेशरे नमः ओम सत्भक्तवृंद प्रभुदाय नमः ओम गणेश मुनि प्रिय सेवितामृतरोरुवाय नमः ओम गीतोपदेश सारादि वृंद संसिद्ध संशयाय नमः ओम वर्णाश्रम पदाधीताय नमः ओम रसज्ञाय नमः ओम सौम्याय नमः ओम आत्मवदे नमः ओम सर्वावनमस्तानां आराध्याय नमः ओम सर्वसद्गुरुवे नमः ओम आत्मारामाय नमः ओम महाभागाय नमः ओम मातृमुक्तिविदायनाय नमः ओम विरदाय नमः ओम विद्याय नमः ओम विप्राय नमः ओम मुनीन्द्राय नमः ओम भावभोजबलाय नमः ओम दर्शनार्थ सम्माने नमः ओम निरस्मग्नबोधकाय नमः ओम मृच्छादिकर्षादित्याय नमः ओम प्रणामबंधमोचकाय नमः ओम अन्तस्मिरसन्नाक्षवे नमः ओम संसारान्वतारकाय नमः ओम सोनादिश्रीदिष्टरे नमः ओम आत्मविद्या प्रकाशकाय नमः ओम अभिच्युतनिजप्रज्ञाय नमः ओम नैसर्गिक महाकवसे नमः ओम कमंडलुराय नमः ओम सुब्रगौरीवदनाय नमः ओम गुहाय नमः ओम दंडमाणिये नमः ओम कृपापूर्णाय नमः ओम पौरोगविषद्वराय नमः ओम स्कंदाय नमः ओम देवगमाय नमः ओम अमर्तयाय नमः ओम सेनाधिये नमः ओम पुरुषोत्तमाय नमः ओम नमो भगवते श्री अरुणाचल श्री रमणाय नमः ओम नमो भगवते श्री अरुणाचल श्री रमणाय नमः ओम नमो भगवते श्री अरुणाचल श्री रमणाय नमः ओम नमो भगवते श्री कार्तिकाय नमः ओम नमो भगवते श्री दुर्गाय नमः नमो भगवते श्री वल्ली दैवालय नमः ओम नमो भगवते श्री सुब्रह्मण्याय नमः ओम नमो भगवते श्री स्वामीनाथने नमः ओम नमो भगवते श्री दक्षिणामूर्तिये नमः ओम नमो भगवते श्री नटराजरे नमः ओम नमो भगवते श्री भैरवरे नमः ओम नमो भगवते श्री नंदीमहेश्वराय नमः ओम नमो भगवते श्री शिवपार्वतीये नमः ओम नमो भगवते श्री शिवपार्वतीये नमः ओम नमो भगवते श्री शिवपार्वतीये नमः ओम नमः शिवाय नमः ओम नमः शिवाय नमः ओम नमः शिवाय नमः ओम शिवाय नमः ओम शिवाय नमः ओम शिवाय नमः हरि ओम 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 Lord recite Upadesha Sara. दुराजया पदे पदम कर्मदिम्बरम कर्मदक्षिणम कृति महददा मदन कारणम फलमसापदम गदनिरोधकम ईश्वरात्मिकम निश्चयात्मकम चित्तशोधकम मुक्तिसाधकम कायवाङ्मन कार्यमुत्तमं नूतनं जगत् चिन्तनं क्रमा जगतैषधै युगसेवनम् अष्टमूर्तिः देवपूजनम् उत्तमस्तव युद्धमं तदा सिद्धजं जगत् ज्ञानमुत्तमम् आद्यधारया योगसासमं सरलचिन्तनं विरलदपरं वेदभावना सौममित्यजो भावनाभिधा भावनीमदा भावशून्यस भावसुस्तुति भावना बला भक्तिरुत्तमा निरुस्तरे मन स्वस्थता क्रिया भक्ति योग बोधाच निश्चितम् आयुरोधना क्रियते मन जालवशिव योग साधनम् सिद्धवायव सिद्धियायुधा साधयोर्द्वयी शक्तिमूलदा लय विनाशने उभयरोदने लय कदम्बुर भवति नो मृदम् प्राणवन्दना लीनमानसम् एकचिन्तना समेत्यद नष्टमानसो दृष्टयोगिन नित्यमस्तिनिम् स्वस्तिनत्यद दृश्यवानिदम् सिद्धमात्मन चित्वदर्शनम् तत्त्वदर्शनम् मानसं तुमिम् मार्गणे गुणे नैव मानसम् मार्गार्जवा वृद्धयस्त्वहम् वृद्धिमाश्रिता वृद्धयो मनो विद्यहं मन अहमयं पुरो भवति चिन्वद ऐपदत्यहं निजविचारणम् अहमिनासवा यमहं दया सुरवीरस्वयं परमपूर्णस इदमहं वदा अभिज्ञमन्वहम् अहमिलीनके अप्यल्यसक्तया विन्द्रेन्द्रिय प्राणदीधम नामसे कद गज्जडं सस सत्वभासिता चित्तवेदरा अद्वयायति विद्ययायहम् ईसजीवयो देशदीविदा सत्स्वभावदो वस्तु केवलम् येषानद स्वात्मदर्शनम् ईसदर्शनम् स्वात्मरूपत आत्मसंस्थिति स्वात्मदर्शनम् आत्मनिर्द्वया आत्मनिष्ठदा ज्ञानवस्थिता अज्ञानहीनचि ज्ञानमस्तिनि ज्ञानिमन्तरम् किं सरोवमे आत्मदर्शने अव्यया भवा पूर्णसिद्धम् बन्धमुक्त्यति नम्बरं सुखम् विन्ददीयै वस्तुदैविद अहमवेदनम् निजविभानकम् महतितं तवो रमणवादियं महतितं तवो रमणवादियं महतितं तवो रमणवादियम्.
Narayanji, thank you so much for Updesh Ashtotram, and the puja. A warm welcome to everyone for our next in series of discussion on the 42 select verses from Bhagavad Gita. We have with us Sh Raghav Kumar ji, a devotee of Bhagavan, who has been a long-term devotee and a resident near the ashram. A brief background about him. He has been a devotee of Bhagavan for a very long time and has a background in Vedanta study under various acharyas of Rishikesh and Uttarkashi over several years. After completing a degree in technology in 1993 and a few years of research in electronics, he was drawn to the exclusive pursuit of the path of self-enquiry. He was blessed to be closely associated with the Ramakrishna mission, Arsha Vidya tradition, and the Adi Shankara Brahma Vidya Peeth. Since 2001, he divides his time between Uttarkashi and Tiruvannamalai. He occasionally shares what he has learned from the acharyas with fellow devotees. Raghavji, can I please request you to take over and guide the devotees?
Namaste and welcome. So we were discussing Bhagavan's Gita Saraha, and we will pick up the thread where we last had left our session. Om Sahana Bhavatu Sahanau Bhunaktu Sahaviryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Ishvaro Gururatmeti Murti Bheda Vibhagine Vyomavadyapta Dehaya Dakshinamurtaye Namaha. Vande Shri Ramanashe Acharyasya Padabjam Yo me darshayadisham bhantam bhantamaditya. Bhagavan has told us, if you remember, in response to a devotee's question, that one should always study the Gita. So in that spirit, we are doing this study. Bhagavan also had mentioned in his translation of the Dakshinamurti Stotram that he and Adi Shankara are one. That same Shankara within me has composed or translated this stotra. So that is the spirit in which we are studying the Bhagavad Gita. Bhagavan had, as you know, composed a dhyana shloka as a Mangala Ashasanam. We will just chant that and review the earlier shlokas which we have done so far, and then pick up the thread from there. Parthasarathirupena Sravayitva Shubhangiram Parthasartiharo Devaha Kripamurtis Sapadunaha. Sanjaya Uvacha Tanthata Kripaya Vishtam Ashrukurna Kulekshanam Vishidantamidam Vakyam Uvacha Madhusudanaha. So one of the takeaways from each of these shlokas, we will try to see that. So these two shlokas which I had just seen refer to the context where Arjuna was in a very special frame of mind. He was very open to the Guru Upadesha. And that frame of mind generally comes when there is a certain crisis, a certain challenge in a person's life. So Bhagavan has included this shloka at the very commencement of his Gita Saraha, where Arjuna expresses a certain helplessness, becomes open to stepping out of his comfort zone of assumptions and notions, and then the Gita Upadesha starts. So Bhagavan has therefore quite appropriately kept this at the very start of his Gita Saraha. The next shloka, after expressing how Arjuna, in his helplessness, turned to the Lord for a permanent solution to suffering. He no longer wanted any temporary palliative. And so he seeks the Lord's grace for, remember, a permanent and a deep solution, which is only knowledge, as the Lord reveals. The next shloka expresses that idea. Shri Bhagavan Vacha Idam Shariram Kaunteya Kshetramityavidhiyate Etat yo vetitam prahuhu kshetrajna iti tadvidaha. So this shloka immediately jumps, as it were, to a higher level and tries to express the highest knowledge, unfolding the kshetra into kshetrajna knowledge. Kshetra is the body, the field. Kshetrajna is the knower of the body, one who experiences everything. So when Arjuna is actually in the midst of suffering, suddenly we find that the Lord is expounding a very high level of Vedanta there. So this is where we notice that the Guru never underestimates the disciple. He just sees the receptiveness and openness of the Shishya and immediately tries to uplift the Shishya to the highest level of Advaita Jnana, which is why you don't find a progression, first Karma Yoga, then Upasana, and then Jnana. In fact, the other way around has been used both in the Bhagavad Gita as well as in Bhagavan's selection of the shlokas. Directly, the Jnana Yoga is unfolded of talking of the highest self, which is non-dual. So this first shloka starts off expressing the two entities which constitute the whole universe, Kshetra and Kshetrajna. And like I said, the Guru never sees Ajnana anywhere because he is established in Advaita. It is only for the Shishya's sake that he has to come down if necessary. But first, he teaches Advaita Jnana up front. That is what this shloka expresses. Idam Shariram Kaunteya, etc. Now, the second shloka after this tells us what is the Kshetrajna. It says, Kshetrajnam chapimam vidhi sarva kshetreshu bharata kshetra kshetrajnayor jnanam yat tad jnanam madam mama. So these two shlokas are from the 13th chapter of the Gita, if you recollect. Remember that the Gita has 18 chapters, and the first 6 chapters of the Bhagavad Gita are dedicated to or themed on the Tvampada Vichara, which means the discussion and unfolding the reality, the truth of the individual. Whereas the next 6 chapters from 7 to 12 deal with the Tatpada Vichara. Tatpada Vichara means inquiry into the nature of Ishvara, into the cosmic whole, the cosmic being. And finally, the 13th chapter commences with the Asipada Vichara, the Aikyam, the oneness between the individual and the total. Consciousness is just one, and the different upadhis, the different masks, as it were, of consciousness are incidental. With that idea, the 13th chapter commences, and Bhagavan has chosen the first shloka of that 13th chapter here, the first 2 shlokas there. So Bhagavan is, as it were, cutting to the chase and giving us the Aikya Jnanam, the oneness between the individual and the total. That is why these 2 shlokas figure right up there. So here Bhagavan says, or Bhagavan Krishna says, Kshetrajnam chapimam vidhi. I am the Kshetrajna, the knower of the field of the body in every living being. Kshetra kshetrajnayor jnanam yatta jnanam matam mama. That indeed is knowledge, which is the discernment between the kshetra and the kshetrajna. So one point to note here is that knowledge is not something utterly beyond the capacity of the mind. There is sometimes a certain ambivalence. Can the mind get the knowledge, so to speak? So there the answer is that no, the knowledge is a priori. It is even before the mind. At the same time, the knowledge is obtained only through the mind. So you have both of these ideas which are valid. And this verse expresses the idea that jnanam has to be obtained, that jnanam is important. That is the only thing that matters. These days, the word knowledge has come to be associated with a profusion of different fields, and there's an explosion of availability of knowledge. So sometimes the word knowledge gets a certain short shrift, as it were. But in our tradition, knowledge is highly valued. It is Goddess Saraswati. It's not like today's perhaps a common attitude of looking on knowledge as something very, dry or something not very important and sacred. For us, knowledge is held very sacred, even secular knowledge. And more so here, the highest knowledge, which is the discernment between the individual and the total. That knowledge is regarded as the most important knowledge, which frees a man from suffering. So remember the connection. First, Arjuna's vulnerability. Then Bhagavan starts off with the highest knowledge, saying that knowledge alone is going to help you. That is this shloka, the third one. And one important connection between suffering and knowledge, which is sometimes taken for granted, is this. Normally, when there's any suffering, we don't think of knowledge as the solution or the cure, as it were, for that suffering. But this human condition is such that the only solution for suffering is actually knowledge. It's not any other doing, any other karma of any kind. So the reason is because suffering is born of a deep-rooted wrong knowledge, or deep-rooted avidya, as it's called. So that avidya is the cause of all suffering. And that picture, that darshana, that vision is unfolded in the whole of the Guru's instructions. Therefore, that knowledge alone gives freedom from suffering, which is very unusual, because normally knowledge is regarded as like information of some kind. But here, knowledge directly translates into a lived experience. It totally transforms one's lived experience. That is why this kshetrajna jnana is regarded as the highest in this shloka. Then what did we see in the next shloka? We saw that Bhagavan has used this shloka as representing the quintessence of all the Bhagavad Gita. It says, Ahamatma Gudakesha Sarvabhutashaya Sthitaha Hamadischa Madhyancha Bhutanam Anta Evacha. This shloka in the 10th chapter represents the idea that this self which is there in each human being, in even the limited finite embodiment, is one with the Lord. So this shloka is like a Mahavakya. It is Akhandartha Bodhaka, meaning it unfolds the oneness between the individual and total, a very complete shloka in that sense. So this shloka says, Aham Atma Gudakesha, I am the self in all living beings, hidden in the Guha, Buddhi Guha of all living beings. And Bhagavan said that this shloka alone is like the quintessence of the entire Gita. It is like a Mahavakya. After these 4 shlokas, then Bhagavan unfolds the tattva, that is the nature of the self, through various words. So one of the things Bhagavan says here is, Jatasya hi dhruvo mrityuhu dhruvam janma mritasya cha tasmad apariharyethe natvam shochitu marhasi. So you see, Bhagavan is doing something which I mentioned should not be done in casual conversation. When there is grief or any emotion, we shouldn't bring in the Paramartha Tattva to others. It is only for oneself. When there is a person grieving, let us say, over some loss, we do not go and preach to them, all these things are impermanent and so on. We only empathize with their emotion, with their grief. But there is a very special context in which Paramartha, the highest truth, has to be brought in. That is the Guru-Shishya communication. So the Shishya is in some distress. The Guru will no doubt give empathy and give some solace, and then he will bring in the Paramartha Tattvam. not in casual conversation between friends and so on. Much caution is required here. Only the Guru is capable of lifting up the Shishya, and so therefore he can definitely and will bring in the Paramartha Jnanam. And here, therefore, Bhagavan says, Jatasya dhruvo mrityuhu, that which is born will die, and that which is dead will be again born. There is never non-existence, like the law of conservation of, if you like, reflected consciousness. So once there is a consciousness manifest in a certain entity, it will continue. The energy or the momentum of that will never get destroyed. It will continue in some other form as per its samskaras, as per its karmas. That is the idea here. And Bhagavan is so lifting up Arjuna to a higher plane. So we note here how many of the deepest problems, or even in conventional, interactions, a problem, they say, doesn't have a solution at its level. You have to rise above the problem, and then the solution comes of its own accord. The problem becomes, as it were, dissolved. So here Bhagavan is trying to uplift Arjuna to a higher level, where the problem ceases to be a problem. That is the vision here. And that Paramartha Jnanam, Bhagavan is unfolding by trying to bring in a totally different perspective, not just at the level of the problem itself. You are going to a higher level. That is the idea mentioned in this shloka. The next shloka says, Na jayate mriyate va kadachin nayam bhutva bhavita va na bhuyaha. So this is where we were in the last session. So as I mentioned here, this shloka says that any born entity has this 6 different changes or transformations. And these transformations are negated in the case of the self. The self is free from these conventional changes or transformations that every entity in this kshetra, in this srishti, is subject to. What are those changes, or what are those, transformations? They are traditionally mentioned as birth, that is, something is born, jayate as it's called, and then asti. Asti means it continues to exist after coming into existence. So you can take an example of, let's say, a seed which lets out a sprout. So first the seed just brings out a sprout, the sprout which will later become a huge banyan tree or something. Excuse me. So it will first bring out a sprout, that is jayate. Subsequent to that, the sprout continues to exist. It doesn't wither away and die. That is known as asti. Jayate is born, asti continues to exist as an entity. Then the sprout starts growing. So what is the process of growth called? Vardhate. It will experience vriddhi. Vriddhi is growth. So jayate, asti, vardhate. Even in human beings, the same transformations are seen. And then the 4th transformation is known as metamorphosis or total transformation, like a disruptive change. So that is known as viparinamaha. So viparinamate, as it's called. So we have now 4. Jayate, born, asti, continues to exist, vardhate, it grows, and viparinamate, that is, it will totally transform into something different from what you might expect. Like a caterpillar becomes a butterfly. So there's no continuity in terms of its evolution from being a caterpillar. It's so different, becomes a butterfly. Even in the case of human beings, you have, let's say, young children, and then they become adults. They are so different. Many new samskaras come up which are not at all present. You cannot even imagine they are there in the child. So that is known as viparinama or metamorphosis, transformation, viparinamate. Then the 5th one is apakshiyate. They start to decay. After a while, after the tree in this particular case becomes old and starts to decay, starts to deteriorate. That is apakshiyate. And then last transformation is mriyate. It gets destroyed. It ceases to exist. So these 6 transformations are traditionally called the Shad Bhava Vikaras, 6 traditional 6 ways of transformation that every entity in this Vyavahara undergoes. Jayate, Asti, vardhate, viparinamate, apakshiyate, and mriyate. It dies. Now, this shloka in Bhagavad Gita is negating each of these transformations. The first line gives a summary, as it were. Na jayate mriyate va kadachin nayam bhutva bhavita va na bhuyaha ajo nitya shashvato ayam purano na hanyate hanyamane sharire. So this sentence says ajaha, it is not born, meaning jayate doesn't obtain for this consciousness. Consciousness is never born. We can never say consciousness is born. We can say it manifests in a particular body. It will be present and get reflected in a body, but it is never actually born. So ajaha, ajaha is unborn. So the consciousness is never born. That's the first word, ajaha. Then you have the word ajo nitya shashvato ayam purano. Nityaha. Nityaha means it will continue to exist for all eternity. It will not cease to exist. So this word nityaha negates the last of the transformations called maranam. So na mriyate, it will not die as well. So the first and last are first negated. Consciousness is neither born nor will it die. Na jayate ajo nitya shashvataha. Shashvataha means it continues to remain undecayed. It is always existing without any damage to it. Shashvataha. The word durable implies something is nearly shashvataha. The durability is unprecedented for consciousness. So this negates what is known as decay or apakshaya. So these three transformations, born or birth, death, and decay, are negated by these three words: ajaha, nityaha, and shashvataha. Then ayam puranaha. Puranaha is that which is very old. We use the word Purana as old stories and so on. But actually, there's a very nice way Sri Shankara explains this word. He says, Pura api navaha. It is although very old, nevertheless ever fresh, ever new. Pura api navaha. Older than the oldest, and yet it is very fresh, ever new. So that word Puranaha negates the idea of growth. Something needs to grow and become new and fresh. Here it's not like that. The growth is not there. It is as old as it was before. It remains as it was before, and yet it is ever new, ever fresh. It doesn't have any oldness to it, so to speak. So Puranaha negates apakshaya, decay. Then we have what we call the Shashvataha negates apakshaya, Puranaha negates vardhate, vriddhi, or growth. So growth is negated through Puranaha. The word Puranaha implies no need for growth, not apakshaya. For growth, we use the word Puranaha. No growth is there in consciousness. We can't say growing consciousness or diminishing consciousness. Such an idea doesn't obtain. Okay? And after Puranaha, we have the word ayam, indicates that this is existing here. So the ayam word is used to correlate with asti. An object exists even after it is born. So you see how these words are correlating with the 6 Shadbhava Vikaras. All those Vikaras are not present for consciousness. That is the idea. Ajo nityaha shashvataha ayam puranaha nahanyate hanyamane sharire. It doesn't get destroyed even if the sharira changes beyond imagination. So here the word hanyate doesn't mean total destruction. Na hanyate hanyamane sharire implies that even when the sharira becomes totally transformed, like metamorphosis, the consciousness doesn't change. So the last phrase there in the shloka negates viparinama or metamorphosis. So that is the way this shloka negates all these different changes. Through each of these words, we are asked by our Guru to just come back to oneself and see that consciousness is free from any of this. Consciousness is the self free from any of this. That is the idea. It is like a contemplation. Different ways the Guru is expressing and explaining, unfolding this to bring our mind to constantly dwell on that unchanging consciousness, free from the different changes. So after this shloka, the next shloka Bhagavan has chosen is also an interesting shloka. It negates the effect, how different elements or different objects in this creation can affect the Atma or the self. We will read the shloka now. Achetyo yamada yoyam akletyo ashoshya evacha nitya sarvagatasthānuhu achaloyam sanatanaha achetyo yamada yoyam akletyo ashoshya evacha nitya sarvagatasthānuhu achaloyam sanatanaha. So the word-to-word meaning of the shloka is achedyaha, that which cannot be cleaved or damaged by any material physical object, that which is made of some matter such as a knife or any other gross material of the Prithvi Tattva, as it is called. Achedyaha, it cannot be cleaved. Adahyaha is that which cannot be burned. It cannot be scalded by fire. Then achedyoyam, adahyoyam, akledyaha. Kledyaha is to wet something. So akledyaha is that which cannot be wetted or cannot be moisturized by water. It is beyond the access of anything like water there. Akledyaha. Then ashoshya evacha. Ashoshya is that which cannot be dried by wind or dried by the Vayu Tattva. So all these four elements, Prithvi, water, Prithvi is earth, then up is water, Vayu, air, and Agnihi, fire, cannot touch this Atma Tattva. One helpful way of visualizing this is how when in a cinema theater, you have a theater on which different scenes of fire and damage are projected, they do not at all affect the screen. Even if there is fire, the screen is not burnt. Even if there is a huge wave of water, the screen is not wetted. So all of these are just projected on that screen. And in our case, in the exemplified, consciousness is like that screen on which these different elements are just projected. This projection, therefore, does not affect the basis or the substratum. If we see or if we dwell on this, therefore, we are able to see that all that is happening externally to the body, to the mind even, does not really affect us. So we try to apply this knowledge in our Vyavahara as well. The whole purpose of these shlokas is that we try to embody it in our life in whichever context we are in. So that is the real challenge there, that in any context where we are distressed or upset, we bring in this very idea that consciousness is like that screen on which these different experiences are being projected. Therefore, they cannot at all affect the truth or the reality of me. Here a doubt can come that no doubt in principle it seems okay, but then the emotions are produced. Some distress is there brought about by the situations. Well, there what our gurus tell us is that we can allow the response without resisting it, but stay with the conviction that the guru's words are the truth. So we don't actually fight the emotional response that comes in these different situations. Instead, we stay with the conviction that the Guru's words that Aham Atma, I am that formless consciousness, I do what I need to do. However, I am not ultimately damaged or hurt by whatever is happening. That conviction keeps us balanced, can keep us strong with reality, strong in staying rooted in reality. So that is the challenge of sadhana, where these ideas that consciousness is not affected by the five elements, the four elements are mentioned here. Even Akasha is extended. The same analogy that Akasha too doesn't touch consciousness is extendable here, as we will look at subsequently. So this truth that consciousness is unaffected, untouched, has to be brought in, especially in the challenging situations where we are prone to become worked up or prone to feel distressed or anxious. That is the real challenge here. So there's one interesting conversation here, which I thought I will share with you. And Bhagavan there refers to how certain effort is required, no doubt, to stay with the Atma Tattvam. One of the disciples asks Bhagavan, if everybody is already a jnani, because they're all consciousness, right? Each one is in truth already consciousness. So the disciple asks Bhagavan, if everybody is already a jnani, where does the quest for jnana arise forth into relevance? So that is the disciple's doubt. If we are already that, where is the question of any quest or any seeking of any kind? So Bhagavan replies, pulling back the clouds does not create the sky. Okay? Pulling back the clouds does not create the sky. But if you want to see the sky, the clouds must go. It is true that all are potential jnanis. Only a small number, however, manage to generate sufficient force of introversion of mind to result in its destruction. So a very profound, idea Bhagavan has taught here, saying that if you want to see the sky, the clouds must go, and therefore only a small number manage to generate sufficient force of introversion to result in the destruction of the mind. Destruction of the mind means here destruction of avidya. Of course, that is the case. So what Bhagavan says here is that there is a definite effort required to stay with this tattvam, to stay with the upadesha. And the force of introversion there refers to the fact that so many situations just suck in or absorb the mind. We become identified and distressed by that situation. It is there that we have to do our homework. So that is where the mind has to be turned inwards. So here, the word turned inwards does not mean that we do not respond to the situation or we become passive. What it means is that we act without our own subjectivity, our own ragas and dveshas clouding our intellect. So what Bhagavan says in terms of the force of introversion implies that we no longer are influenced by our own, past experiences of fear, of anxiety, of trying to avoid the situation. None of these are there. Whatever needs to be done gets done. However, we remain rooted in that inwardness. That is what Bhagavan is saying here. In another similar conversation, Bhagavan is asked by a disciple, what is the difference between the mind and the self? And Bhagavan says, there is no difference. The mind turned inwards is the self, and turned outwards, it becomes the ego and all the world. The cotton made into various clothes we call by various names. The gold made into various ornaments we call by various names. But all the clothes are cotton, and all the ornaments are gold. The one alone is real, the many are mere names and forms. But the mind does not exist apart from the self. That is, it has no independent existence. The self exists without the mind, but the mind never exists without the self. So the idea here is that when the same mind is turned outwards, it gets buffeted and affected by all these elements and all these experiences. But that very mind turned inwards rests as the self. We don't even have to say the mind becomes the self. Bhagavan says the same mind turned inwards is the self. So in another way, we can say the mind resolves in its source. That's another way of putting it. So the idea is that there is no mind apart from the self, which is Advaitam. So this inward force of introversion is the big challenge for all of us. So whenever there's a situation, that is where we have to bring in these shlokas, these instructions. So once this shloka then goes on to say that all the four elements don't affect the self. And then the next line in that shloka says, Nityaha sarvagataha sthanuhu achaloyam sanatanaha. Nityaha, we have seen this before. In this context, the word Nityaha means that which is not produced. That which is not produced. It doesn't have a starting point when it was actually manufactured. So Sri Shankara explains, or the tradition explains these words here in an interesting way. It says that, look, any karma or action that you do consists or can be looked at in four different ways. Four different types of karmas or actions are producing something that is known as utpadanam. So we try to produce something afresh. Then we try to reach somewhere, such as reaching, let us say, Tiruvannamalai from Delhi. So we try to reach some place from somewhere else. There's a spatial difference there. That is known as praptihi. So first is utpadanam, production. Other is praptihi. You try to attain or reach some place. Then the other type of karma or action consists in modifying something's shape or form, such as a pot being turned into a clay. Or another better example is how milk is curdled and it becomes yogurt. So that is known as vikaraha, a kind of change which is nearly irreversible. So the milk turns into curd, that is known as vikaraha. That is another type of action which is accomplished by putting a sample of curd and so on. And the last or the fourth type of karma or action is known as samskara. Samskara in this context means to purify something. It's like a cloth is dirty, then I can put it for washing and brush it such that the dust or the dirt is removed. Samskara is to purify something. So these four kind of karmas are possible. Utpadaha, then you have praptihi, then you have vikaraha, and they have samskara. So these four karmas are not possible with respect to Atma. Atma being impartite, doesn't have parts and it doesn't have any gunas, qualities, is not subject to these four karmas. So we say Atma is Nityaha, means Anutpadyaha. It is never produced. The self is not even produced by parents. In fact, Shankara says self is not even produced by Ishvara, because Ishvara himself is the self. So we don't even say that the self, the Atma, is produced by Ishvara. The individual being is not produced by Ishvara. He is one with Ishvara. So it is Anutpadyaha, it is not produced. Second aspect is that consciousness, which is you, is not also attained, because you're already attained, you're already that. So there's no question of getting there. All getting is within Vyavahara, within the empirical realm. So there is no praptihi either. The third of these karmas, whatever it does, is known as vikaraha. So there is no vikaraha, there is no way of modifying the self into something which it is not, changing the shape of the self. That too is not possible, because it is the very adhisthana, the very substratum. You cannot change the shape of clay. You can change the shape of a pot, perhaps, and change it into some other clay object, but there is no question of changing the shape of clay itself. Even so, vikaraha is not possible. It is avikaryaha. The consciousness which is you are not subject to any modifications. You are always full and complete. That is the idea here. The last one is also an important word there. It is asamskaryaha. It is not subject to any purification either. So all purification is only at the realm of the mind to the extent it is required. The self doesn't need any purification. There were many philosophers and darshanikas in India who thought that the self needs to be purified of its impurities. So in Advaita, we say the self doesn't need any purification. We just need to bring the mind to a certain minimum level of purification, so to speak, so that Atma Jnana can arise. It can become a wild goose chase if one goes on purifying the mind over and over again. And it's an asymptotic process. You never reach 100% completion or purification. So there's a minimum degree of Shuddhi, which is required, no doubt. But at some point, there is a quantum leap, and the consciousness, which is me, which is I, is recognized as not touched by any purity. So one never strives for 100% purity. There is a certain degree of purity, and then the Guru Upadesha itself does the job. So that is the beauty here. The Guru's Upadesha itself brings the necessary purity, provided some minimum prerequisite is there, minimum Shraddha in the Guru, minimum openness to the Guru's Upadesha is there. This very Upadesha of Bhagavan will give the necessary purity. Therefore, we don't need to really purify the self. It is already pure. Samskara is not required. So this shloka is expressing that idea. Nityaha sarvagataha sthanuhu achaloyam sanatanaha. Nityaha means it is not created. Sarvagataha, it is everywhere, all pervading. So you cannot reach it. There is no prapti. Then sthanuhu. Sthanuhu is something very fixed in its form. You cannot modify it in any way. The word sthanuhu is like a pole or a post or like a stake. So it is so, permanent in its shape, it cannot be altered. That is, it is not subject to vikara. And then the last one is stan achalaha. Achalaha means that which doesn't, have any change in its properties. So sometimes in the older tradition or in traditional, Indian culture, we had these polished mirrors. So we didn't have a silver, a polish. We would have these metal, which is polished so thoroughly, it will be like a mirror. In Kerala culture, for example, they have what they call an Arunmula Kannadi, as they call it. So that kind of a polished metal mirror can still lose its polish after a while. It doesn't change in its shape or something, but it catches some, degradation or some dust and so on. So such a thing doesn't happen. It is achalaha. Achalaha means it doesn't change even in its properties. Like a mirror, it doesn't need again polishing sometimes. So that fourth change of samskara, achalaha takes care of the fact that no samskara is required, no polishing or purification is required for consciousness. So these four changes that karma can do are negated for Atma. So this is a very powerful, teaching, because if no karma can really change anything in Atma, nothing is to be done, really speaking, which is why Bhagavan would put it that one has to merely own up the truth that I am pure, that I am already whole. It's a question of owning up that reality. And where, like I said, we work on is to bring in that force of introversion. The owning up is not a one step or a one moment process. Wherever in our life or in our challenging situations where this Atmatattva is lost sight of, we are getting carried away by the content of our experience, we pull back. That pulling back alone, Bhagavan says, is like pulling away the clouds to see the sky. The sky is there even before. The sky is supporting the very clouds, and yet the human being, because of his limitation, needs this pulling away of the clouds in order to appreciate the sky. So that pulling away is required, and that is where these instructions are, so to speak, embodied in our life. Wherever they are applicable, we have to bring in this teaching. How karma of these four kinds does not affect or cannot touch Atma, because Atma is not subject to any of these changes that karma effects on objects. So after this shloka, we will see the next shloka. Avinashitu tad vidhi yena sarvamidam tatam vinashamavyayasyasya nakaschit kartumarhati. Avinashitu tad vidhi yena sarvamidam tatam vinashamavyayasyasya nakaschit kartumarhati. So this shloka also is from the second chapter. It is the shloka number 17. Bhagavan has, as we saw, reordered these shlokas with a certain flow. Remember what I said earlier, that Bhagavan's idea was to present first the Arjuna Vishada, the context. Arjuna is in grief. Then the second and third shlokas give you the big picture, that jnana is the solution. And then the fourth to the 10th shloka, which we are seeing, we are now at the 8th shloka. These shlokas Bhagavan has ordered indicating the tattvam, that very unfoldment of what is Atma, what is consciousness. So this tattvam is unfolded now. And subsequent shlokas will tell us things such as what happens when the tattvam is understood, what is the gati or the journey of the one who has owned up this knowledge, and so on. Other aspects of sadhana are then also brought in there in later shlokas. So right now we are with Bhagavan's unfolding of the tattvam, or the reality itself being unfolded through the words. So one incidental fact I will mention here is that the words of the Bhagavad Gita and even the Guru's words are not just for an intellectual or an academic appreciation. Instead, these words are direct pointers to what we are. So if we dwell on these words with appropriate openness, directly the mind is brought into a state of Atma Vichara. So that is the power available in these words. They are tools for nididhyasanam. They are tools for inquiry, self-inquiry. That is the vision, or that is the attitude we have in understanding these words. So here in this shloka, avinashi tu tadvidhi. So the key words are avinashi means indestructible. Tadvidhi, know that to be indestructible. Know what to be indestructible? Yena sarvamidam tatam, by which all this is pervaded. So Krishna is now bringing Arjuna to a totally different perspective of looking at the soldiers in front of him, not as just human beings who are his relatives, and then he is going to kill them. Instead, he is trying to bring a perspective of looking at them as just names and forms, which they, with their own tattvam or their own innermost core as well, being indestructible. So he's telling Arjuna, look, you cannot destroy even these people in front of you. You may think you are, harming them, but not really. You're just doing your duty, what you need to do. And they are actually indestructible anyway. So relax. He's telling Arjuna, you should relax, not feel any guilt over this particular duty that you have. You should do what needs to be done. So tad vidhi, know that by that knowledge, you will be able to relax and without any unnecessary guilt, do what you need to do. That is the vision here. Yena sarvam idam tatam, that by which all this is pervaded. Then vinasham avyayasyasya, the destruction of this unchanging entity called consciousness. Nakaschit kartumarhasi, no one can accomplish it. It is not possible for anyone to do that. So here you can see a very important aspect of the way Advaita Jnana is taught, which is for oneself. And when it comes to the Guru Shishya communication, the Paramartha Tattvam is only talked of. So we should bring in that highest truth when it comes to our own actions. But when it comes to others, we do not teach or preach. That becomes like rationalizing their situation. So we don't tell it to others. With respect to others, one has to do one's roles, one has to do one's expression of empathy, and whatever we can do to help them, we do that. But we don't preach Vedanta to them. That is only for oneself to apply in one's own life. And yes, the Guru alone can bring in and force it literally on the student, trying to lift him up to that higher plane of Paramartha Tattvam. So Krishna is here saying, Tad Vidhi, oh Arjuna, you should know that higher truth. Only then you will be able to do your duty without any wrong attitudes. So you notice that this knowledge will definitely affect the way we deal with the situations. So it's not as if this knowledge is a dissociated knowledge, which sits somewhere deep in the mind, and then everything continues as usual. That doesn't happen like that. The knowledge of Advaita Jnanam definitely will transform the way a person deals with his life, with his roles. They are totally changed by that. One way of saying it would be that when the Jnanam of Atma Tattva is appreciated and understood by the Guru's grace, a person may drop off many things he was doing earlier. Let's say he was pursuing money and so many other pursuits with a certain vigor. He may prioritize his time and energy totally differently now. It's not that he tries to, give up something and run away from something. That's not the idea. He just loses interest in things which were earlier of great motivation for him. So the Advaita Tattvam therefore can have that effect, where we let go and stop doing things that we were doing earlier. One effect. Another effect, also equally important, many things that a person was very hesitant to do and was afraid to do, and probably had some inhibitions about doing, he may actually go ahead and do them because that is what is appropriate. And in this case, Arjuna was in that situation. He was supposed to do that fighting in that battle, and he was hesitating. So Advaita Jnana freed him from that obstruction in his mind, and he will gladly do the will of Ishvara. He will gladly do what his kartavya is. There is no hesitancy. So Advaita Jnana therefore frees those blocks in the mind, which makes a person not do what he is supposed to do. So that is the effect here. Tad vidhi. Krishna says, know that. And then no one can destroy that. So why do you think you are able to harm or, affect your relatives adversely? You're just doing your duty. You will not be able to destroy them. So you just go ahead and do what you have to do. Arjuna's, being exhorted by Krishna accordingly by bringing in Advaita Jnanam. He is not telling Arjuna some Vyavaharika logic. He has tried that. But here it is a profound teaching of Advaita, which will free up Arjuna to do what he has to do. That is the same logic that applies even to us. When we receive the Guru's Upadesha, two things, like I said, can happen based on the person's situation. We either let go of what we are needlessly doing, which is no longer a priority really, which we have outgrown to a certain extent. Those priorities, those pursuits are either dropped off or they take a second, role, second place in our list of priorities. Or alternatively, what a person has to do in his given situation, but he is hesitant to do, he will do with full vigor without any inhibition. That is the power of Advaita Jnana. And the Guru's grace makes one discern what is appropriate, whether it is to give up something or to actually do something which is being blocked from being done by his mind. So this is the import of this particular shloka. We will take up some more shlokas in the next session. I'll just spend a few minutes now on a couple of questions that came up in the last session. One of them was related to the diagram of self-inquiry, which was drawn by Bhagavan, and it was shared in the book called Self-Inquiry. And I will try to share that screen, and then we will just see how this diagram embodies some of the initial shlokas in Bhagavad Gita Saraha. So I will just try that. 1 minute. I'm sure we can share screen here.
Raghavji, there is a green button which would say share screen.
Yeah, it says share, and then it goes a photo. Do I do that? Maybe photo from far away. Let me see if it works. Yeah, I think it went. Yeah. So, are you able to see this?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. So this diagram was sketched by Bhagavan, and it embodies, or it represents in a very concise way what is the kshetra, the kshetrajna, and the details as well. So why it is helpful to see this is, first of all, it is Bhagavan's own a model, so to speak. And the other thing is, it's also something that we can apply, so to speak, in many situations. It's very versatile. It is all-encompassing. So it's helpful to just spend a couple of minutes seeing this diagram. Here you can see the lamp, as it were, at the center, which is between the figures 1 and 7. That lamp Bhagavan has used to represent the self, Atma, that is the I. And the innermost chamber is known as the deep sleep state. The 7 number represents the Sushupti Avastha. Then from the deep sleep state, there is a small door which is numbered number 2. That too is the door to sleep or sushupti. That door opens of its own accord, according to the law of karma. So no one can open the door by an act of will. Why is that so? Because the mind itself has not yet come into being for free will to be exerted. It is a priori before even the mind comes. So the deep sleep state is opened up, so to speak, by this door called two, in line with karma. The person's karma makes him wake up. And then what happens? The light of the self, which is numbered 1, streams through that little door and becomes number 3, which is numbered 3. It is at the doorway or the veranda, as it were. So it's just the doorway number 3, where the first sprout of consciousness has come, as it were. So it's no longer pure consciousness. It is now what is known as the Mahat Tattvam. Mahat Tattvam means the first disturbance in Prakriti. It is the first onset of some limited existence. So the Mahat Tattvam encompasses what we call the Samashti Buddhi. It is the collective I sense. So it's not yet having so much diversity. It is just at the borderline between the causal, which is the deep sleep, and the dream, which is the next chamber. The next chamber is number 8. 8 is known as the dream state, where this light of consciousness gets reflected of the mirror called number 5. Okay, Bhagavan has numbered it as 5. That 5 is the ahankara. It's a mirror. It's shaped like a square. So the square mirror here reflects the light of awareness. And then you project this dream world for yourself, including even a dream body with dream friends, dream mountains. That is all projected by your own Shakti, your own Swayam Jyoti, your own self-luminous consciousness. That is number 8, which is the dream avastha. So remember, 7 is Shukti, deep sleep avastha. 8 is the dream avastha. And then this light being reflected from the mirror number 5 goes out through the senses, the jnanendriyas, which are numbered 6. All the 5 of them, there are 5 orifices through which the light streams out and creates 9. 9 is the Jagrat Avastha. Jagrat Avastha denotes the waking state, where you have your own physical body and other bodies as well. So these 3 avasthas are 7, 8, and 9. 1 is the self, who is known as the Kshetrajna. Okay, in our case, 1 is the Kshetrajna. And all the other numbers here represent the Kshetra. Different aspects of the Kshetra are all these other numbers. So the one who discerns these numbers, what they are, what is Kshetra, what is Kshetrajna, that is the true knowledge. That is the idea here. And the number 4 represents the causal body, the Karana Sharira. What is causal body? Causal body implies that in deep sleep, whatever you experience is the avastha, but what is the cause of that experience? That is known as causal body. The causal body makes you have that experience of deep sleep in that particular way. So, and then state 8, as I said, is the dream state. And any other thing I have missed out? Yes. Or these are the numbers here. Okay. So the Kshetra and Kshetrajna are both represented in this diagram. So we'll see, we can use this as a kind of reference figure for all other discussions when Bhagavan's model, so to speak, of Srishti is being talked of. So we will continue our discussion in the next session. We will end with the Shanti mantra. Om Purnamada Purnamidham Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Harihi Om. Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Harihi Om. Thank you, Nuragji, and all of you.
Raghavji, thank you so much for another enlightening session. A quick check with the devotees. If they have any questions you may like to share now, or feel free to share with me later. It is entirely up to your comfort. Viewers on YouTube may also like to consider sharing their questions right away or later.
Yes, they can also just write it as a comment in YouTube or anywhere, and we can cover it in the subsequent sessions. Either way, if any doubts or any questions, anything they find is relevant to the session.
Absolutely. Doesn't seem like any immediate questions, Raghavji.
Yes. So we can end the session and continue
Sure.
to do the chanting of Aksaram.
Thank you so much, Raghavji. Once again, a very grateful session today. Thank you. Narayanji?
Yes, sir. Reciting 14th stanza of Akshara. Karunavaramani Ramanadiyantuva Kainacholiya Gadiyaya Arunachalamene Agame Ariyoke Aya Shivanude Ayari Arunachalavaratyatra Aksharamanam Aleshatra Karunavaramapati Arunachala Shiva, Arunachala Shiva, Arunachala Shiva, Arunachala, Arunachala Shiva, Arunachala Shiva, Arunachala Shiva, Arunachala. Arunachalam Nagame Vinay Pavara Gande Verarupa Arunachala Ayati Sundarame Agamuni Abhinamani Arunachala Arunachala Shiva Arunachala Shiva Arunachala Shiva Arunachala Arunachala Shiva Arunachala Shiva Arunachala Agamboditu Agarukai Shiraya Amarvitarenkol Arunachala Arukayanaya Nanaya Divam Pariti Arunachala Arunachala Shiva Arunachala Shiva Arunachala Shiva Arunachala Shiva Arunachala Shiva Arunachala Ippaditam Unaye Ninaitin Tan Viniyar Viduva Arunachala Arunachala Shiva Arunachala Shiva Arunachala Shiva Arunachala Arunachala Shiva Arunachala Shiva Arunachala Shiva Arunachala உன்னையே மாற்றி ஓடாதுள்ளத்தின் மேல் உறுதியாயிருப்பார் அருணாச்சலா ஊத்துக்கு உழந்திடார் உன்னை கண்டு அடங்கும் அழகை காத்தருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல Arunachala Shiva Arunachala Shiva Arunachala என்னை அழித்திப்போம் என்னை கலவாவிடிலிருவோம் ஆண்மை அருணாச்சலா ஏனிங்க உறக்கம் என்னை திரழுங்க Arunachala Shiva, Arunachala Shiva, Arunachala Shiva, Arunachala Shiva, Arunachala Shiva, Arunachala Shiva, Arunachala. ஐம்புல கழுவன் அகத்தினில் புழுவோ அகத்தினிலையோ அருணாச்சலா ஒருவன் நம்மை மொழித்தேவர் வருவார் இது அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா Arunachala Shiva, Arunachala Shiva, Arunachala Shiva, Arunachala. Omkara Guru Uyarnil Unayararva Arunachala. Avvai Polenadu Arulai Tadu Alvadu Arunachala. Arunachala Shiva, 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 Arunachala, Arunachalam Mani, Anbalan Bari. Aksharmanamale வாழ்க சூயம் பிரகாசம் வாழ்க வாழ்கவே சூழ்க சக்தி சூழ்க சூழ்கவே வாழ்க சூயம் பிரகாசம் வாழ்க வாழ்கவே சூழ்க சக்தி சூழ்க சூழ்கவே ஏழுலங்கு ஜீவன் முக்தி இன்பம் பொங்கவே ஏழுலங்கு ஜீவன் முக்தி இன்பம் பொங்கவே இதயமாறும் இறைவனார் எல்லாம் போகவே இதயமாறும் இறைவனார் எல்லாம் போகவே வாழ்மனம் மகன்மை வாழ்வு பாழ்வு தொழிகவே வாழ்மனம் மகன்மை வாழ்வு பாழ்வு தொழிகவே பரமசச்சிதானந்தாத்மன் வாழ்வு பரமசச்சிதானந்தாத்மன் வாழ்க சூயம் பிரகாசம் வாழ்க வாழ்கவே சூழ்க ஆத்மசக்தி சூழ்க சூழ்கவே லட்சுமிநாத நித்திய தேவ தத்துவமோகவே லட்சுமிநாத நித்திய தேவ தத்துவமோகவே தன்மயத்து சின்மயத்தே ஓகவே தன்மயத்து சின்மயத்தே ஓகவே எட்டு திக்கும் அம்ச சோகம் எதிரொலிக்கவே எட்டு திக்கும் அம்ச சோகம் எதிரொலிக்கவே எல்லாம் பிரம்மம் என்னும் உண்மை இருக்கவே எல்லாம் பிரம்மம் என்னும் உண்மை இருக்கவே வாழ்க சூயம் பிரகாசம் வாழ்க வாழ்கவே சூழ்க பிரகாச சக்தி சூழ்க சூழ்கவே அம்சசோகம் அதேதான் அம்சசோகம் Om Guru Vasya Vasavaya Bhargo Devasya Dhimahi Dhiyo Yona Prachodayat Dev Savita Vishwa Satyendana Prasannami Amrita Swaha Om Pranaya Swaha Om Avane Swaha Om Jnane Swaha Om Dane Swaha Om Samane Swaha Om Brahmane Swaha Om Namo Bhagavate Shri Raghavaya Namaha Om Namo Bhagavate Shri Raghavaya Namaha Namo Bhagavate Shri Raghavaya Namaha. Puraganda Goshiram Nevidyam Samarpayami. Madhya Devanyam Samarpayami. Amudam Putrabhasam Samarpayami. Girajam Samarpayami. Girajanandra Masvaniyam Samarpayami. Yom Yom Yudhivara Samayitam Nagavariya Kalyotam Karpurna Surna Santam Pratikam Karpura Nirajanam Samarpayami. नमो भगवते श्री रघुनाथ श्री रघुनाथाय नमः। नमो भगवते श्री रघुनाथ श्री रघुनाथाय नमः। नमो भगवते श्री रघुनाथ श्री रघुनाथाय नमः। आत्मयाय नमः। विदाय नमः। अभिवेदाय नमः। यो भाव पुष्पम वेदा पुष्पवान प्रजावान प्रथमान बोधि चंद्रमा पुष्पम पुष्पम पुष्पवान प्रजावान प्रथमान बोधि ओम तत् ब्रह्मा ओम तत् वायु ओम तत् आत्मा ओम तत् सत्यम ओम तत् सर्वम ओम तत् गुरो नमः अंतःकरण बोधे से गुहायाम त्वं यज्ञ कम वसंकार कम मित्र कम रुद्र कम विष्णु कम ब्रह्म कम प्रजापति ओम तथा वो ज्योतिर्गो मुदम ब्रह्म कर्मणामले विद्यानयते अमृतत्वमानसु परेणाहं भूतं भूयाय विद्यादते सत्योपनिषत्ति वेदांत विज्ञानते विद्यात्मा संन्यास योगापदे शुद्धसत्त्वा ते ब्रह्मलोके परान्तकाले परामृतात्मनि सर्वे आरम्भभावं परमे स्मभूतं यत् कुण्डलीलं पुरमत्य समुत्सदं तत्रान्तरं करणं दिशोगत् तद्विज्ञानंतर धर्मादित्य यो वेदांतो स्वर जो वेदांत सत्य प्रतिष्ठित तस्य प्रतिज्ञानस्य परममेश्वर मंत्र पुष्पम श्री समर्पयामि मंत्र पुष्पम श्री मुरारी समर्पयामि मंत्र पुष्पम श्री पार्वती की समर्पयामि ओम तत्सत्मार्पणमस्तु हरि ओम हरि ओम हरि ओम यानि यानि पावानि मात्र विकास है
Thank you, everyone. Namo Ramana. This brings us to the closure of today's Sunday Satsang. We shall reconvene next Sunday and continue the discussions and the session with Raghavji on 42 verses of Bhagavad Gita. Namo Ramana.
Right.